In the winter of 1932, in a coal town outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, a woman named Dorothy Hale sat at her kitchen table with $11 and a family of 6 to feed until spring. Her husband had not worked in 4 months. The bank across the street had already closed its doors for good, taking 40 families' savings with it. But Dorothy did not cry. She reached under a loose floorboard beneath the stove, pulled out a small tin box, and began sorting coins into 6 tiny piles. What she did next, quietly, without ever telling a soul outside her own kitchen, kept her family fed, clothed, and together for 3 more years. Today, we're uncovering 10 silent money rules that families like the Hales followed during the Great Depression. Rule number 1 will surprise you, but rule number 7 is the one almost nobody talks about anymore. If stories like Dorothy's move you, hit subscribe now, because we bring these forgotten lessons back every day. And tell me in the comments, could you survive on what she had?
Rule 1. The waste not ledger. Before there were banks people trusted, there was a notebook. Dorothy kept hers in the drawer beside the icebox, a 5-cent composition book with a faded blue cover. Every evening, after the dishes were dried and the children were in bed, she sat under the one working lamp in the house and wrote down every single cent that had passed through her hands that day. 4 cents for cornmeal, 2 cents for thread. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. This was not bookkeeping for its own sake. It was survival mapped out in pencil. During the Depression, families who kept a written ledger were far less likely to lose their homes than families who guessed their way through the week. Dorothy's ledger told her, almost to the penny, how many days of flour she had left before she needed to trade for more. It told her when a debt to the grocer was creeping too close to what she could repay. It told her the truth, even on the days she didn't want to hear it.
Here is what almost nobody remembers. The ledger wasn't just a record, it was a warning system. When the numbers on the page didn't match the coins in the tin, Dorothy knew, days in advance, that something needed to change. A neighbor's ledger caught a landlord's overcharge before it bankrupted her family. Another woman's ledger revealed she was paying twice for the same debt because she never had proof of what she'd already given. Today, we call this a budget spreadsheet, but the Depression-era ledger had something modern budgeting apps don't. It was written by hand, every single night, no matter how tired she was. That daily discipline is what made it work. A budget you only look at once a month can hide a disaster for 30 days. A ledger you face every evening cannot lie to you for more than 24 hours. Dorothy's ledger from 1932 survived in a shoebox for 60 years. Her granddaughter found it after she passed, still able to read exactly what a family of 6 spent to survive one of the hardest winters in American history. What she found written on the very last page of that year is something we'll come back to before this video ends. Rule number 2. Cash only, envelopes only. There was no such thing as a credit card in Dorothy's kitchen. There was no such thing as buy now, pay later. There was only what was in her hand and what was in the tin. This single fact shaped nearly every decision a Depression-era family made, and it is the rule modern families have lost the most completely. Dorothy divided her $11 into 6 small envelopes, each one labeled in pencil. Coal, flour, milk, shoes, church, emergency. When the envelope for flour was empty, there was no flour until next week, no matter how badly the children begged. There was no borrowing from the shoe envelope to cover it. The boundary was absolute, and that absoluteness was the entire point. This wasn't stinginess, it was architecture. A family that spends only what sits inside a labeled envelope cannot spend money it doesn't have, because the money that doesn't exist is not there to spend. Compare that to a modern credit line, which whispers just a little more every single time the balance runs low. The envelope never whispers. The envelope simply runs out. One neighbor of Dorothy's, a woman named Helen, kept her envelopes inside a hollowed-out family Bible, believing no burglar would think to look there. It worked. When her husband's hours were cut in half that November, the Bible envelopes were the only thing standing between her children and going without dinner 3 nights a week. Here's the modern translation. You don't need a tin box or a hollow Bible today. Many banks now let you create separate buckets or sub-accounts, one for groceries, one for gas, one for the electric bill. The friction Dorothy felt pulling coins out of the flower envelope is the same friction a sub-account creates when you have to consciously move money between them. That tiny pause, that half-second of, wait, do I really need this, is the entire mechanism that kept Depression-era families solvent. It still works exactly the same way now. By the second winter, Dorothy's envelope system had done something she never expected. It had built her a hidden emergency reserve, one small penny at a time, for money nobody in the house even remembered handing over. Rule number 3. Mend it before you replace it. Dorothy owned exactly 2 dresses, one for church, one for everything else. When the everyday dress tore at the elbow that spring, she did not think, even for a moment, about buying a new one. She threaded a needle by lamplight, turned the fabric inside out, and stitched the tear so close to invisible that her own husband never noticed the difference. This was not about being poor. This was a discipline that ran through every class of American household during the Depression, because a new dress cost real money that simply did not exist, and mending cost only time, which in a house with no work to go to was the one thing families had in abundance. Shirts got their collars turned when the fabric wore thin at the neck. Socks got darned on wooden mushroom-shaped tools passed down through 3 generations of women. Shoes got resold at the corner cobbler for a dime instead of replaced for $2. Every single one of these small acts of repair kept a family's clothing budget at nearly 0 for years at a time. There is something else hidden inside this habit that historians rarely mention. Mending gave women something to do with their hands during hours filled with worry. A torn dress became 30 minutes of quiet, focused work. A small problem with a clear beginning and a clear end at a time when the bigger problems, the bank, the mine, the mortgage, had no clear end in sight at all. The needle and thread were not just repairing fabric, they were repairing something in the woman holding them. Here's the modern translation. You don't need to darn socks on a wooden mushroom today, but the instinct behind it still applies. Before you replace something, ask if it can be repaired, resold, restitched, or restored. A $15 cobbler visit can add 3 more years to a good pair of shoes. A 5-minute button repair can save a $50 shirt from the donation pile. The Depression generation didn't see mending as a lesser choice. They saw it as the smarter one. Dorothy's church dress, the one she mended 11 times over 6 years, was the same dress she wore the day her husband finally went back to work in 1935. Rule number 4. The Sunday stockpot. Every Sunday afternoon in the Hale household, one large pot went on the stove and did not come off until Monday night. Whatever the week had left behind, a chicken carcass, the ends of vegetables, a heel of stale bread, went into that pot with water and whatever herbs grew wild near the fence line. By the time it finished simmering, that single pot had turned scraps that most families today would throw directly in the trash into 3 full days of hot meals for 6 people. This was not a special occasion meal. This was the entire strategy. Depression-era women understood something that modern grocery shopping has almost erased from memory. Nearly every part of every ingredient can be used if you're willing to let time do the work that money usually does. Bones become broth. Broth becomes soup. Soup becomes a base for whatever vegetables happen to be cheapest that particular week at market. There was a second, quieter benefit hidden inside this ritual. Cooking once for the whole week meant the stove only needed to be lit a handful of times instead of daily, and coal, remember, was its own precious rationed expense. A family who batch cooked on Sunday wasn't just saving on food, they were saving on fuel, on time, and on the exhausting daily question of, what do we eat tonight? At a moment when every other question in their life already felt impossible to answer. Here's the modern translation. You don't need a wood-burning stove to use this rule today. A single pot of soup, stew, or chili made once on a Sunday can realistically stretch across 3 to 4 dinners during the busiest week of your life. The real value isn't just the grocery bill. It's the version of you on a Wednesday evening, exhausted, who doesn't have to cook from scratch because Sunday you already did the hardest part. Dorothy's Sunday pot never had a name and never had a written recipe. It was simply whatever the week had left over, transformed into whatever the week ahead required. And in a house with almost nothing extra, that pot was, in its own quiet way, the difference between hunger and enough. Rule number 5. Keep your struggles behind closed doors. Nobody outside the Hale family ever knew exactly how close to empty that tin box under the floorboard really was. Dorothy wore her one good church dress every single Sunday, sat in the same pew, sang the same hymns, and never once let her neighbors see the arithmetic happening quietly behind her eyes. This wasn't pride for its own sake. It was a survival skill almost nobody talks about today. During the Depression, a family known to be desperate became a target for higher prices at the store, for landlords unwilling to extend one more week's grace, for gossip that could cost a husband the one job interview that might have saved them. Dorothy understood that dignity itself was a kind of currency, and she spent it as carefully as she spent her coins. This is different from dishonesty. Dorothy never lied about her circumstances if a neighbor asked directly, and she quietly helped other families whenever she had even a little extra to spare. What she refused to do was broadcast her hardship to a world that would not respond with kindness, but with calculation. She kept her home clean, her children's faces washed, and her voice steady, not to fool anyone, but to protect what little control she still had over her own family's story. There's a modern lesson buried in this that has nothing to do with pretending everything is fine. It's about who gets access to your financial reality. Not every coworker, not every distant relative, not every acquaintance on the other end of a phone call needs to know the exact number in your bank account. Privacy about money isn't secrecy, it's a boundary. The same boundary Dorothy drew around her kitchen table 80 years before anyone had a word for financial privacy at all. By the time her husband found steady work again in 1935, not one neighbor on that street had ever guessed how close to the edge the Hale family had truly come.
Dorothy had protected something even more valuable than money. She had protected her family's ability to start again without a single mark against their name.
Rule number 6. Trade what you have for what you need. Cash was the rarest thing in Dorothy's life, but skill was not. She could sew. Her neighbor Ruth could not sew a straight seam to save her life, but Ruth's husband kept chickens and always had eggs to spare. So the two women made an arrangement that never involved a single coin. Dorothy mended Ruth's children's clothes. Ruth left a dozen eggs on the porch every Friday. Neither woman ever wrote it down. Neither woman ever needed to. This quiet barter economy ran underneath almost every Depression-era neighborhood in America, invisible to any bank, any tax collector, any official record, yet it kept families fed and clothed in ways that raw dollars alone never could have managed. A man who could fix an engine traded his time for a sack of flour. A woman who could can vegetables traded jars of preserves for someone else's surplus tomatoes. Nobody called it an economy. They called it being neighborly. But make no mistake, it was one of the most sophisticated financial systems of the entire decade. What made this system work was trust, built slowly over years between families who knew exactly what each other was capable of. Dorothy's sewing was worth something specific and reliable to Ruth. Ruth's eggs were worth something specific and reliable to Dorothy. Neither woman ever had to explain the exchange rate. Both of them simply knew it, the way you know the value of something you've relied on for a decade. Here's the modern translation. You may not have a chicken coop or a sewing machine, but you almost certainly have a skill someone nearby would trade for. Tutoring for a home-cooked meal, yard work for a car repair, childcare for a haircut. The instinct to immediately reach for cash, for a card, for an app, has quietly erased a form of wealth that costs nothing and asks for nothing but fairness in return. By the time the Depression eased, Dorothy and Ruth had traded goods and labor for nearly 4 straight years without a single dollar ever changing hands between them, and neither woman ever once felt like she owed the other anything at all. Rule number 7. The rule almost nobody talks about. Feed sack wisdom. This is the one we promised you at the very beginning. The rule that has quietly disappeared from memory faster than almost any other. Flour and animal feed in the 1930s didn't come in plain paper bags. They came in printed cotton sacks, and manufacturers, noticing that women were repurposing every single one of them, began printing the fabric in floral patterns and soft checked gingham, specifically so those sacks could become something else entirely. Dorothy bought 50 pounds of flour every few weeks, not only for the flour itself, but for the sack it came in. Once emptied, washed, and pressed flat, that sack became a child's summer dress, a set of kitchen cartons, a pillowcase, or a square in a quilt that would eventually cover an entire bed. A family that went through enough flour sacks in a year could clothe a growing daughter almost entirely from fabric they had already paid for as food. This is the detail almost nobody remembers correctly. It wasn't waste turned into thrift by accident. Rule number 8. The Family Money Council. Every Sunday evening, after the stockpot had done its work and the dishes were dry, the Hale family sat together at the same kitchen table for 10 quiet minutes. Dorothy's husband would ask what the ledger said. Dorothy would answer, honestly, no matter how the numbers looked that week. The children, even at 7 and 9 years old, understood which envelope was thinning and why supper might be smaller on Thursday. This might be the most quietly radical rule on this entire list because it runs completely against a habit many households still carry today, keeping money a secret, even from the people it affects most.
Dorothy and her husband never shielded their children from the truth of their circumstances. Instead, they gave them just enough of the picture to understand why choices were being made without ever burdening them with fear they were too young to carry. There was a practical reason behind this honesty. A 9-year-old who understood that shoes were the priority this month didn't beg for candy at the store. A 7-year-old who knew coal was running low didn't leave a door open in January without being asked twice. The family council wasn't about scaring children into obedience. It was about turning every member of the household, no matter how small, into a partner in the family's survival instead of a bystander to it. Historians who've studied Depression-era households consistently find the same pattern. Families who spoke openly about money, within reason, at the dinner table, weathered financial shocks with far less internal conflict than families who kept every number a closely guarded secret between the parents alone. Here's the modern translation. You don't need to hand your children a spreadsheet, but a short, honest, age-appropriate conversation about the family budget does something no amount of hidden struggle ever can. It builds trust instead of confusion, and it raises children who understand money as a shared responsibility rather than a mystery that magically resolves itself as long as nobody asks questions. By 1936, both of Dorothy's children could read a household ledger better than most adults on their street, a skill neither of them ever forgot for the rest of their lives.
Rule 9. Never spend the very last dollar. Of all $11 Dorothy divided into envelopes that winter, one silent rule sat above every other. No matter how desperate a week became, no matter how empty the flour envelope looked, there was always one single dollar that never left the tin box beneath the stove. Not for coal, not for milk, not even for Christmas. This wasn't superstition. It was a hard-won lesson from families who had already lost everything once and refused to let it happen twice. A household with absolutely nothing set aside was one bad week away from a debt it might never climb out of, a landlord's patience, a doctor's bill, a broken shoe sole in the dead of winter. That one untouched dollar wasn't meant to solve a crisis. It was meant to buy the family a single day's breathing room to figure out what to do next. Dorothy's tin held that $1 for nearly 3 years without ever being touched, through hunger, through a bitter January with barely any coal left, through a whooping cough scare that terrified the entire house. It stayed hidden beneath that floorboard because both she and her husband made a silent agreement neither of them ever broke. This money was not for living. It was for the day living became impossible without it. That day never fully arrived for the Hale family, and that, in its own strange way, was the entire point. The dollar's value wasn't in what it purchased, it was in what it prevented. The desperate borrowing, the panicked decision, the choice made out of fear instead of clear thinking. Just knowing it existed changed the way Dorothy faced every other hard choice that winter. Here's the modern translation. Whatever your version of that one untouched dollar looks like today, a locked savings account, a jar you genuinely never open, its power was never really about the amount. It's about training yourself to treat some money as simply not available, no matter how convincing the reason to spend it might feel in the moment. And this brings us finally to what Dorothy wrote on the very last page of that ledger the day her husband went back to work.
Rule number 10. Gratitude at the table. On the night her husband came home and told her he had steady work again, Dorothy did not go out and celebrate. There was no money for that, and after 4 years, celebration itself had started to feel like a foreign language. Instead, she sat down at the same kitchen table where she had written in that ledger nearly every night for 4 years, and on the very last page of the 1935 book, she wrote something that had nothing to do with money at all. She wrote down 3 things that had gone right that year. Not the big things, not the job, not the return to normal life. Small things. A mild winter that had spared them extra coal. A neighbor's kindness with a basket of vegetables in October. Her daughter's laugh returning after months of quiet worry. This habit, ending each hard season by naming what had still gone well, ran through Depression-era households far more than most people realize today. It wasn't blind optimism. Families who lived through those years had every reason for bitterness, and many carried it. But the ones who seemed to recover fastest, who rebuilt their sense of stability quickest once work returned, were often the ones who had trained themselves, night after night, to hold both truths at once. This year was hard, and this year still held something worth keeping.
This is the lesson Dorothy's granddaughter found 60 years later on the final page of a shoebox ledger nobody in the family remembered still existed. Not a number, not a dollar amount. 3 small, handwritten lines about gratitude, sitting at the very end of the hardest 4 years her family ever survived. Here's the modern translation. However tight your week has been, however far the numbers in your own ledger feel from where you want them, this rule costs nothing and asks only for a few honest minutes before bed. Name 3 things that still went right. It won't pay a single bill, but it might be the exact thing that lets you face tomorrow's ledger with steady hands instead of shaking ones. Dorothy Hale never became famous. She never wrote a book, never gave a speech, never once thought of herself as someone with lessons worth passing down. She was simply a coal miner's wife in Pennsylvania who kept a notebook, divided $11 into 6 envelopes, and refused to spend the very last dollar in the tin, no matter how bad the week became. And yet, sitting here nearly a century later, everything we've just walked through, the ledger, the envelopes, the mending, the stockpot, the quiet dignity, the barter, the flour sacks, the family table, the untouched dollar, and the gratitude written on that final page, still works exactly the way it did in 1932. Money habits, it turns out, don't expire. They only go quiet for a generation or two, waiting for someone to open the right shoebox or watch the right video and remember them. Dorothy never knew her ledger would survive 60 years past her own kitchen table, but it did, and now so will these 10 rules in yours. Do you think a family today could survive on $11 a week the way Dorothy did, or have we lost that ability for good? If Dorothy's story stayed with you, subscribe now, because we bring these forgotten survival lessons back every day. Like this video if even one of these 10 rules is something you want to try in your own home, and leave a comment below telling me which rule surprised you the most. We read every single one.